intelligencesquared.com.
Now we're about to open up this debate for questions from the floor. I can tell you what the pre-debate of the vote result was. 100 people didn't know what they felt. 166 people felt that indeed the baby boomers had stolen the family silver, and 96 thought they hadn't. Now, I think that this may be a unique debate in which you're not quite sure whether Ed and Penny are on the sides that they're actually lined up for. So all I can counsel you to do is to stick to which of these beliefs you still hold at the end of the argument, rather than which side you're on as far as the individuals go. You'll get frightfully confused. Can I start by taking questions? And can you wait for the mics to come to you? And it would be very nice if you'd say who you were. If you take that gentleman in the middle of the row first, I'll take them in groups of 3. And if there's someone in particular you want to put your question to, then do say.
Hi. It strikes me that 3 of the members of the panel all agree that the family silver has been stolen and or destroyed.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
It strikes me that 3 members of the team agree that the family silver has been stolen and or destroyed. But the 2 of them blame the government rather than the baby boomers. So my question to you, Laurie and Ed, would be, who elected that government? Which generation did that come from? And who was running the media, the judiciary, the pressure groups, all the other sources of accountability for that government? I would put it to you that by virtue of being the biggest generation, they have an excess of political power. And while they were working, they used that to elect people who lowered taxes and who gave them their money back. And now that they're retiring, worryingly, they're going to use that political power to elect people who protect pensions and who spend more and more money on geriatric healthcare to try and keep them alive for as long as possible.
Thank you very much. I assume you prefer euthanasia. What was your name?
Alfred.
Sorry, Alfred. Thanks, Alfred. There was a hand up. Albert? There was name. Someone with a hand up over there? Nope, it's gone down again. Any more questions? Yes, the gentleman in the middle of that row.
So if you're following your thesis, Mr. Willits, then the one way in which the boomers extracted their parents' cash was by abolishing all of their savings in the 70s. So actually at that point, collapse of the financial markets and really a negative investment returns now is an eminently good thing. So surely we should let the markets collapse.
I think you can come back on that one when we've had the 3rd question. Somebody right over here.
Thanks. I'd like to ask David Willits to expand a little bit on a point that he made about social mobility, because he, I think, says that there's a lack of a conversation between the generations, which is problematic, and that what he's just said tonight is the only place that conversation takes place is through the family. And yet, at the same time, when you look at all the discussions that are going on at the moment in government circles around social mobility, it all seems to be about blaming the family for the problem of a lack of social mobility, and in fact further undermining that conversation that takes place between the generations.
Thank you very much. And what was your name?
Sorry, Sally Millard.
Sally, thank you. David, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, on that final question, I do think that families have become more important. Yeah, I think that's kind of, and that's where that's the part of Frank's argument that I agree with. That I do think one of the things that's happened to our society is that because in general the intergenerational contract is weaker, we're trying to offset that by doing it more in this kind of escalating arms race of investing in our own kids. That is partly the response to it. And the evidence, and it's a particular problem in Britain, is that young people in Britain spend longer with their peer group and have less engagement with other adults apart from family members than in most other advanced European societies. So that is even something that's a particularly acute challenge for us. And the paradox, therefore, is that what a family can do either to transmit opportunity and advantage from one generation to the next, or sadly to transmit disadvantage from one generation to the next has become more significant in our society. On the inflation, I didn't quite follow the argument, but without getting, I'm not a sort of great conspiracy theorist, but certainly one of the other things that happened for the boomers, and this goes back to the very first question about voting behaviour, is that when boomers were young, we were much more tolerant of high inflation when we had very large debts. And now that we've become older, we've shifted to a culture which is, by and large, a low inflation culture, where 5% is regarded as a very serious rate of inflation, when I remember when it was 20%. So yeah, I think that that is another factor. And what I'm arguing is not I noted down something said, are they screwing young people? What I do think, and this is a fundamental issue I think we should try to focus on, is we have been so preoccupied in post-war Britain with divisions of class and income and perhaps ethnicity that we haven't thought about how all these policies pay out for people who are in different age groups. And my disagreement with Frank is I do think when you look at it, the age group you belong to, the cohort you belong to, really does help explain quite a lot about the circumstances you're in.
Thank you. What about the question about the baby boomers were the generation who voted the politicians in?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's kind of what I'm saying. They didn't... this was an environment in which there were a large number of voters who, when they were starting up, when they'd got the first mortgage, had a significant interest in inflation reducing the value of the debts that they had taken on to buy the house. So there was a period of high inflation that did match. I'm trying to link the first and the second question. So my view is, although it's not a sort of direct conspiracy, it certainly was the case that one of the reasons why we baby boomers are sitting on so much equity in our houses is precisely because inflation wiped out the burden of our mortgages, because we did have high inflation after we'd taken out those mortgages, and now we're in a low inflation world when the scenario is rather different for us. That is part of the argument.
Thank you. Ed, would you like to pick up on some of those points?
Well, look, I agree actually with David that demographics are very, in this limited sense, that demographics are very important when it comes to understanding exactly how our society fits together. But I think the issue about politicians' culpability is an interesting one that's quite complicated. The first thing to say is that we can actually go a bit further than David Willits just did when he talked about inflation and there perhaps being some, not a conspiracy, but some kind of relationship. Well, actually, there have been statements by the Labour Party when they were last in power, repeated statements by politicians that are in the book I wrote, over the years, where they talk about wanting to appeal to this particular cohort because they're large in number. Why wouldn't they? They're in a democracy and they want to pursue them. But it's more complicated even than that, because it's not simply the case that the baby boomers elected these people, and so of course they're to blame, they're the electors, you get the politicians you deserve, because actually it turns out that the state is wildly complicated, because we're a massive economy with lots of people in it, and our government does very, very complicated things. And what I particularly object to is that over a series of decades, I think our politicians systematically failed to consider the long-term needs of the country, and here are some examples. So think about the sale of council houses, which at the time was considered to be such a good thing. Now, when they received the receipts from the sale of those council houses, that money went immediately into tax breaks rather than into more housing or into some other more sensible and long-term way of spending the money. If you think about housing policy and the fact that there's been this incredible growth in housing value in the UK, well, why did that happen? Fundamentally, because in the 1990s, when the stats were first kept, actually, for the age of first-time buyers, what you find is that there is a massive restriction of supply under, Chris Patten's Housing Act. And then, actually, you look at the big liability, which is public pensions and public sector pensions. There's a brilliant debate that appears in Hansard in the mid-1990s between Frank Field and Tim Yeo, when Frank Field, if you recall, was thinking the unthinkable and got sacked for it. And it was at exactly that point that Frank Field was considering these long-term liabilities and the fact that they're unfunded. And he made the case that we should actually be paying more for them. And Tim Yeo, who was the minister at the time, said, well, actually, what the Labour Party is proposing feels like a tax. It's not a tax, but it's like a tax, i.e. don't for a second consider thinking about these long-term liabilities because you'll have to pay more money. And that's pitiful. They all thought that they could get away with it, and actually, in the end, they can't. And that's my objection.
Thank you. Laurie.
The most important factor in terms of determining how wealthy or successful or how good a quality of life a person will have is not how old they are, but how wealthy their parents are. And I think that brings us back to both the question of to the question of families, which I think is the important one. And it's very interesting that Mr. Willits is saying, started off his remarks by saying, well, we're talking too much about class and wealth and ethnicity and not enough about generational conflict. Isn't that the point? Isn't that the whole point of talking about generational conflict? So you don't have to talk about class. You don't have to talk about wealth disparity. You don't have to talk about ethnicity or gender or any of these uncomfortable, intractable problems. On the question of family, I find it interesting, again, that Mr. Willits is saying, oh, well, it's a problem that, all the passing on of advantage or disadvantage is concentrated in families. And, we're talking more about families than we are about collective inheritance. And that is the stated policy of the Conservative Party in government. It puts itself forward as the party of family, but not all families, a specific kind of family which is predicated upon a two-parent, property-owning nuclear household, which is meant to be, from now on the main vehicle for passing on wealth and opportunity in society. When we talk about social breakdown, look at the riots. We don't talk about class. We don't talk about poverty. We put it all down to families. We blame it on family breakdown, like the person who asked the original question said. And I am wondering how we can meld these two ideas. I mean, Mr. Willits says it's a problem that we're blaming everything on family, but the government is saying that family is the key issue here.
Laurie, wasn't Mr. Willits saying exactly that families are problems because class disadvantage gets concentrated if people can't make any kind of connections outside them? You seem to me to be agreeing on this point.
Yes.
For once.
Yes, families are a problem, but I'm saying this is exactly what Mr. Willits was saying, but how does that square with the policy of his party in government, which is the precise opposite?
Thank you. Frank?
On families, I think the real issue is that the reason why they become more important is not because in physical or absolute terms they become more important. It's just that other intergenerational interactions have decreased and diminished in significance. And the real problem that we're faced with is that we have to rely on families in a very modest way for generational interaction, for the very simple reason that most adults are not allowed or feel estranged from behaving in an intergenerational way with younger people. And one of the huge problems we have in this society, in Anglo-American societies, is the total estrangement of generations where they rarely occupy the same physical space, and where they rarely interact in a kind of creative kind of a way with one another. And I think that's the real discussion we need to be having, about how you kind of put right this kind of fundamentally human dynamic that takes place within the communities. How do we get an intergenerational conversation going in an ordinary, taken for granted kind of a way, rather than just simply having hectoring and kind of big debates here and there? How do we take it out of the family, which is a very narrow, privatized way of dealing just with your own kids, so that I, as a man, aren't just simply interested in my own child, but have a responsibility towards children in general. There's two problems that also we're missing out on. One is the problem.
I completely agree. That's brilliant. I completely agree with it. That is the argument. I agree.
That's three people agreeing on the panel.
Right. There's a problem here, which is that in British society there are two groups of people that we cannot seem to be able to handle properly, and we stigmatize them. One is the elderly. And I can give you lots of examples of how we can talk about the elderly.
You're only allowed 15 seconds more on this.
And the other one are teenagers, who we also find very difficult. And it's interesting that policy is going towards pathologizing those two sections at the moment.
Thank you. We're going to take some more questions. Lady in the middle there in the red trousers. We're going to make shorter questions and shorter answers now, especially since so many hands have suddenly shot up.
Hi there, my name's Hayley. I just want to ask Mr. Frady in particular what he thinks about unpaid internships. In his speech, he actually outlined that he thought that basically young people just want to take from their parents. They don't want to actually do anything, they want it handed to them on a plate. But what about the thousands of graduates, well-educated people, deserving of a job who work every single day for nothing? Surely this is an example that the young aren't taking from the old are taking from the young, and they're exploiting them.
Thank you. Great question. Lady here with the necklace. Yep.
Actually, I must say I'm French, and it's very interesting to follow this debate because in France we have exactly the same problem, and there has been also books written, "Our children will hate us." And I just have a remark. We have not followed the same policy in England and in France. Very different, actually, but we have the same problems. So it cannot come to a problem of politics.
Is there a question you'd like to put to the panel?
Yeah, to both young people.
You mean me?
No.
Yes.
So you were arguing it was a question of government. Since we have very different policy in France, but still we have the same problems. So it's irrelevant to say it's a question of politics.
Thank you. Can we take the lady here in the green, and then the gentleman at the end, and then we'll get the panel to answer.
What do you think the idea that the younger generation were promised all these things and they're not being delivered, which is why we feel the family silver has been stolen? Because I would love to be a graduate with a job earning £20,000 after, so that I could pay back my student loan, but it's not going to happen. So,
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear that. Were you saying what were the younger generation promised?
We were to be promised things like if you go to university, you'll get a job and then you can pay back this money, but there are no jobs. We were promised these things and we feel that family silver has been stolen because we don't have them.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman at the end.
It does seem to me that through several of the pieces here, you can actually piece together the history. The 1970s does seem really grim, and I'm really glad I didn't have to work during the 1970s. Inflation being high did erode the debt, but the flip side of that was that interest rates were very high, which made paying for mortgages very expensive. So it appears that the baby boomers actually worked damn hard for a long period and now do have all of the wealth. And the decision needs to be, do we punish them for having all of the wealth and try and confiscate it from them? Or do we have to work much harder as a younger generation in the way that they did through the 70s and early 80s? It appears that there's a 10-year period in the 90s where we've all been lulled into a situation that life should be easy. And we now feel bitter that maybe it's not as easy as we thought it would be.
Thank you. Great question. I'm going to ask the panel to be very snappy in response. Can I just say, by the way, that the Resolution Foundation has just calculated that for a young, low-income couple, it's going to take 31 years to save for enough money, not for a house, but for the average deposit on a house. Just in case you should think that things are looking too easy for the young right now.
May I come back on the
Yeah, could you be quick, Laurie? Only because time is against us.
Quick as I can. Well, firstly, on the internships question, Hayley's question, I think it's very interesting that it's phrased as the young taking from the old, because of course you can see it that way. Young people working for free for older people. But what internships are also about is a concentration of wealth in the ruling class, in the ruling elites, because it's a way of, because you have to get these internships, you have to be able to afford the internships in order to get those special media, politics, fashion jobs, whatever it is you want. They're a way of people who already have that money or those family connections passing those opportunities down to their sons and daughters. There's no more, apt example of this than the fact that at the recent Conservative black and white fundraiser ball, internships for in legal firms and in fashion houses were actually auctioned off to the tune of thousands of pounds. I believe Mr. Willits was there. On the question, which takes us back to I'm sorry to catch your name, the lady in the green top, who's asking about, what this generation was promised. The question, and if I can respond to both that and the question about hard work. Well, I don't know if you have many friends who are between, say, 18 and 26 at the moment, but the idea that people in my generation don't work hard is just laughable. It's lazy stereotyping. If anybody's been through the Blairite education, I sat down and calculated it the other day. I've sat 316 exams since I was 7 years old, and that's about average. and people work incredibly hard, and then they're promised, sorry, I'm wrapping up, but they're promised that at the end of this, there will be jobs, there will be opportunities. People are starting to see this atomizing neoliberal idea of individuals striving for the lie that it is, and that's the generational political transformation that's taking place. It's not about rage against our parents, it's about rethinking the neoliberal consensus, and that's what makes me really happy.
I'm going to stop you because I think it's wonderful, but you're also going to have a summing up speech in a minute.